When I fall in love, I get dizzy. I fall out there just down to...
This is Historical Hotties, a podcast where we go through different categories of historical figure and try and figure out which one is the biggest babe. Hello, and welcome to Historical Hotties, a podcast where the rules are made up and the points don't matter. No, wait,
No.
That's the wrong thing. No, in this podcast, we take historical figures from different categories and professions, and we rank them against one another to see which one is the quote-unquote hottest. My name is Whitney Nelsen, and I am your co-host along with...
Lindsey Nelsen.
And here we pit hotties against one another based on 4 key categories. Those are mental attractiveness, physical attractiveness, social impact, and what we call je ne sais quoi. And then we figure out, when the scores are all tallied, who is the hottest hottie. Today's category, we have con artists. Lindsay, would you like to start us off?
Thank you very much, Whitney. So I would like to introduce you to my con artist, who is Otto Witte, or as he would like you to call him, Otto the First, former king of Albania.
How did I not know that you were going to pick him? It seems so obvious in retrospect. Guys, listening audience, Lindsay is obsessed with Otto the First, and it never once occurred to me that this would be her pick. Okay, sorry for the interruption. Please continue. Otto the First.
So, Otto Witte was born in Germany in October of 1872, and he spent the early years of his life as an acrobat in the German circus. Except for being a carny, I suppose, zero indication of sort of con artist potential in his early life. But inspiration struck, fate set a path for him when, in 1913, Albania had just become independent from Serbia. And they were trying to figure out who was going to lead them because they no longer had a royal family of their own since they'd been controlled by Serbia for so long. So one faction of the army literally put out a call to a Turkish sultan asking for one of his younger sons to be their king and the head of their new royal family. This was in all the newspapers and stuff like that, and one of Otto's friends at the circus, Max, who was a sword swallower, pointed out that Otto looked a lot like this Turkish prince. And from there, they got the idea that, well, why don't I try being that Turkish prince? So they got dressed up with a bit of an entourage from the circus, and they rode into Albania, and he claimed that he was Halim ad-Din, the Turkish prince, here to be their new ruler, according to him, and spent 5 days as king, where, according to him, he was crowned as king, claimed a harem, declared war on Montenegro, and then ran off before he could be discovered, taking a sizable portion of the Albanian treasury with him when he went. Now, most of these facts are per his specific storytelling, as he spent most of the latter half of his life in the arts district of Hamburg, Germany, with a small one-man stage show where he told the story of this and a bunch of other adventures, like when he ran away with half the Albanian treasury. According to him, he went to Africa and spent some time with some pygmies. Most of his stories, however, can be totally disproven. So how much of the Albania story is true is definitely a matter of some debate. It is true that the Turkish military put out an invitation to the Turkish Sultan, but Halim ad-Din is not the actual name of his son. His name is Burhan ad-Din, so there's some debate about whether he ever actually took the throne or not for any amount of time. Either he pulled off being king of Albania for 5 days, or he pulled off a comfortable living for the rest of his life, claiming to have been king of Albania for 5 days. And that is my hottie con artist.
Okay, that's a good one. All right, so I want to give an honorable shout out to Frank Abagnale Jr., who is a con artist, so it's a podcast, Lindsay, so maybe you should audibly fist pump instead of... But if you're a con artist so famous that they make a movie about you starring Leonardo DiCaprio, I feel like you definitely get, like, a hottie shout-out, even if you are not my pet. So, I would like to take you, dear listeners, on a journey with me to 1817. A strange and tired yet beautiful young woman, about 25 years old, appeared in Almondsbury, which is a tiny town near Bristol in England. She was about 5'2", extremely attractive, and as a quote from one of the townspeople, she was clad in a black stuff gown with muslin frill at the neck. Round her shoulders, she wore a red and black cotton shawl and a black shawl twisted turban style around her head. She spoke no known language that the villagers could understand, and so she had to communicate with the people through, like, gestures. Because she appeared to have been, like, beleagueredly rummaging around the countryside, it was assumed that she was poor, either lost or destitute. So she was sent to the overseer of the poor, who then took her to Knoll Park, which is the name of the home of the magistrate of the county. So at Knoll Park, she was kind of interviewed, but they couldn't get any information from her because they did not speak the same language. At the time, it was pretty dangerous to be a homeless foreigner wandering around because the British had recently defeated Napoleon and sent him into exile, but British authorities were still worried about foreign agents gathering intel on the behalf of Napoleon, and anyone found guilty of disturbing the peace or potentially being a spy was usually in danger of being shipped to Australia or immediately executed. So it was not a good time to be a foreign stranger. However, when the family of the magistrate of the county, him and his wife, met the woman, they didn't find her disturbing or potentially dangerous so much as they did intriguing. The wife, Mrs. Worrell, was fascinated by her. They couldn't figure out the language. It was like nothing that any of them had ever heard. The woman's hands were soft, so it was not one of those of like the middle or lower class. And then when the woman noticed a picture of a pineapple hanging on the wall inside their manor, she got very excited and started pointing and seemed to recognize this as if from her homeland. There were other strange behaviors that they noticed and are written down in documentation, such as refusing to drink out of a glass until she had washed it herself. What was most confusing, however, or should I say intriguing, to the Worrell family was that even though her language and behavior and dress seemed to be exotic, her features were definitely European. So she looked to be Spanish or Greek, possibly a gypsy. She was definitely white, but had some darker features, but didn't look like, at the time in 1817, what was thought of as a native from a foreign country. So the first clue to emerge was actually as they were on their way to take her into Bristol, where she was committed as a vagrant to St. Peter's Hospital, which is she kept pointing to herself and saying caribou. This is spelled C-A-R-A-B-O-O, not like caribou the animal.
That'd be my first thought.
But she would say caribou while pointing at herself, so she became to be known as Caribou. In the meantime, while she was committed to St. Peter's, a bunch of local people learned about her from the Worrells, who were pretty notable figures, so they started to visit her in throngs at the hospital. This encouraged the wife, Mrs. Worrell, to take her back to the manor house because she seemed non-threatening, and the visitors and the everything, and she was still intrigued and trying to figure out who she was, so they took her back to the manor house. At the time that they took her back to the manor house, a Portuguese sailor appeared who claimed to be able to speak her language by means of sign, gestures, and articulations, and found out that she was, according to her own account, a daughter of a man of rank of Chinese origin and from Javasu. Caribou also claimed that she was a princess, and this is a quote from her, or from the sailor, the Portuguese sailor, carried on men's shoulders in a kind of a palanquin, and to have been adorned with several peacock's feathers on her head. Furthermore, she declared that while in her garden she had been kidnapped, carried off by a nefarious crew, and sold to the captain of a ship that set out to sea. After 5 weeks at sea, when the ship was near land, she claimed to have jumped overboard. Then she found herself on the Gloucestershire coast when she had wandered about for 6 weeks until she arrived at the tiny town of Almondsbury.
6 weeks?
It's a lot of wandering around, you guys.
I mean, before finding anybody, yeah, that's a lot of wandering.
Yeah.
England's not that big, you guys.
So, when the magistrate of the poor in this small town learned that Princess Caribou was actually foreign royalty, they immediately announced her presence at their house to the newspapers and to whoever would listen to them in royalty in all of England. And pretty soon everyone in the surrounding areas knew about Princess Caribou. And for quite some time, the princess lived at this manor in a grand style. She would spend her days entertaining guests by, like, dancing and fencing and climbing trees, praying to a god with a made-up name, entertaining all of the visitors that came to see her, and most notably, swimming naked in the lake when she was alone, which that behavior gained her enormous notoriety in 1817.
Sure it did.
And the Worrell family just sat around and, lapped up all of the reflected glory of having this foreign princess in their home. But then, once the newspapers got a hold of it and printed a likeness of her sketch in the newspaper, a woman called Mrs. Neal immediately recognized her and revealed that she had been recently employed as a servant, where she had entertained the children by speaking a strange nonsense language of her own creation, and that her true name was actually Mary Baker, daughter of a cobbler in Devonshire. And at that point, she had to reluctantly admit that she was a fraud.
That's not usually how that goes down when you're found out. That seems like kind of a peaceful resolution for...
There's a lot of... I'll actually talk about this a little bit more further down the line, but there's actually a lot of reasons that went into her not really suffering a terrible fate from this con. Namely, she didn't steal anything. It was all given to her. Mm-hmm. But also, she had an incredible amount of charm.
Yeah.
And was notably, in multiple accounts, beautiful. It aided so much in her portrayal of Princess Caribou that everyone kind of grew to love her, and it sustained her after she was unmasked. But that is my pick for Hottie.
Very interesting. Mary Baker, Princess Caribou.
Uh-huh.
Both got fake royalty happening.
What can we say? We have a type.
All right, so now let's pit these two against each other in our categories. So, let's talk about their mental attractiveness.
All right, go first.
So, for Otto, obviously, I just think one of the things that's attractive about con artists in general, and why people enjoy watching an Ocean's 11 movie, is the sort of, not only the intellect, but the daring.
Totally.
And the sort of ability to think so outside of the norms. Like, it just wouldn't occur to most people if they were told they looked like this Turkish prince, to just be like, oh, why don't I pretend to be that Turkish prince and claim Albania? I think just for that sort of unconventional daring, by all accounts, quite charming and a great storyteller, because made his living for the second half of his life by telling these grand tales of things that he did. So very engaging and compelling. I don't see a huge amount of foresight in anything that he did. It seemed like he was more kind of just going for it. So I'm not going to give him sort of like intellectual genius status, but I think still very intellectually appealing, and I would give Otto a 4 out of 5.
Okay. I would agree with that. 4 out of 5. I could get down with that. For Mary Baker, on the other hand, there's two things that kind of play into, and this is debated, how much she was aware of the political climate at the time, and how much that played into what she was doing. But there's kind of two things. That is right at the time where the aesthetic of romanticism was happening in Europe. Byron, Keats, Shelley, all of those were happening right at this time. And she very much, everything that she did with her character was a romanticized image of the Orient. The Orient and Africa and everything anyone knew, which was not a lot, about any country that wasn't Europe. She basically took all of the best parts of that. She put together a complete romanced package to fit the culture of the time. The second thing is that Napoleon was the most powerful symbol of the challenge that was faced by European aristocracies, because at the time the power of the European aristocracy was crumbling. And so she was 100% representative of the lower classes who, through talent alone, had challenged the upper classes, and she won in this battle of wits, basically, at least temporarily. all of the press afterwards, rather than, like, raking her through the coals, were sort of gleeful about how
pulled one over on those
pulled the
inbred
wool.
aristocrats.
Exactly. She had pulled one over on the vanity and greed of the high-born aristocrats, and so she very much, and it's hard to say how much she knew going into it, that this is exactly what the political and sort of pop culture climate is this romanticized image of the Orient and Africa, paired with a not really having the consequences, because that's exactly what the political climate was at the time, that this lower class maid in Devonshire could pull off this elaborate scheme, which just helped to crumble the aristocracy even more. So for that reason, I think it's everything that you were talking about with, I can't remember his real name, I only remember Otto the First.
Otto Witte.
Otto Witte, yeah. I think it's all of those things of being obviously impulsive and kind of throwing caution to the wind, because you never know what will happen in these sorts of situations. But also, a lot of people feel like there was a lot of calculation and social awareness that went into her portrayal and what she was trying to do. So I'm going to vote a 5 for her.
Yeah, well, she definitely seems to be able to tap into a zeitgeist. She understood both the capital R romantic literary trend and was able to present herself as this lost, soulful, romantic figure, and pulling one over on the aristocracy. And I think also, like you were saying, there was this crumbling of monarchy and this realization all of a sudden that maybe they weren't somehow different kinds of people, that they were just, that she could pretend to be royalty and convince aristocrats, but that there isn't actually anything different about aristocrats than anybody else. It'd be hard to know how much of that was intentional, though, and how much of that was just her being intuitive about what was going to play and what wasn't going to play. So without knowing that she was intentionally doing some sort of grand art piece political statement, I will give her a 4 out of 5.
Well, that's exactly the debate, is it seems to have been intentional enough that it's possible that it was incredibly politically aware, but also it could just be right time, right place sort of con, that she just happened to tap into what was happening in the world, and she just made up a lie about being a foreigner. So
it could be, too, that if she was just really good at seizing on a narrative, she could have done that with zero intentionality to make a political statement, but as soon as that was the way the press was going, and she saw that it was coming off well for her in the press, that she just embraced it.
So, physical attractiveness.
So, physical attractiveness. Now, if you Google Otto Witte,
most
of what you're going to find is the pictures of him when he was older in his theater in Hamburg, where he's wearing the military uniform and the sort of walrus from Alice in Wonderland mustache.
Exactly what I was going to say. I was going to interrupt you and say, everybody who is listening to this, if you picture in your head the epitome of walrus mustache, like exactly what comes to your mind when someone says walrus mustache, and then you double it, that's what this guy looks like in pictures.
But, like, very fashionable for the time in Germany, But he's still, even in those pictures, like, old walrus mustache Otto, he has a kind of charm and charisma, and there's a definite twinkle in his eye going on. But the couple pictures I managed to find where people think are him when he was younger and in the circus, that guy was, like, straight up Errol Flynn. First of all, acrobat, so he's in pretty decent shape. And the pictures I was able to find that people think might be him are really great, long, angular face, very dashing, very Errol Flynn.
Well, I don't see any of those pictures while Googling. All I see is a rumpled mustache.
Those are all of the predominant ones, and the other ones I had to, do several modify,
And I think that does not necessarily help your case. If I have to do historical research in tomes, in dusty libraries to find a picture of him being attractive, mostly he just looks like his clothes don't fit and his mustache is too big.
But, that's the part where he was famous, was in his older age. We're gonna talk about...
I'm just saying that Mary Baker was famous when she was 25 and beautiful.
Because he didn't get caught right away, and she did, so...
No, I'm just saying, based on the empirical evidence that I have from non-official research, I'm going to give him a 3 at best.
I mean, based on his older Hamburg pictures, I can understand that. But I'm going to give him a 4 based on the sort of Errol Flynn acrobat stuff that I was able to uncover.
So for Mary Baker, if you Google Mary Baker, you're going to find, obviously, that's a pretty common name for a person who was, for most of her life, a very common person. So you will not find too much that actually is her. You will find, if you Google Princess Caribou, quite a few sketches and renderings. There's not a lot in the way of, like, paintings, and obviously this is a little bit early for photographs, so you're not finding any specific good depictions. She's kind of all over the map as far as artist renderings of her. I found some where they definitely tried to make her look more exotic than she was. There are some where she looks very attractive, some where, like, her eyes are kind of sunken, and her eyebrows are sort of verging on unibrow, and so a lot of them, they focus more on her, like, weird, quote-unquote, exotic garb that she would wear.
I was gonna say, I'm surprised how Persian and or Turkish a lot of this looks, considering that she was claiming to be from China.
I think she said her husband was from China. She's from the island of Javasu, is what she said. I don't even know, and I'll be honest, I have not Googled this. I don't even know if Javasu is a real place.
I could see, based on the peacock feather palanquin sort of stories, that sounds much more Indian than...
Yeah, when I Googled Javasu just now, everything that came up with this was a story about Princess Caribou. So I'm assuming that Javasu is not real.
Or maybe she was thinking about Java or something and couldn't quite remember the name.
Or maybe it's so tiny that the biggest news that's ever come out of the island of Javasu is Princess Caribou and there's nothing else. By pretty much every account that I found, any quotes... I didn't find too much, like, press-type stuff, but anyone who was in her presence specifically talked about her beauty. And I think that that's a big part of her being able to win over as many people as she did with this story, is that she was a tiny little brunette pretty girl. And in being sort of Spanish or Greek or something that's sort of like Mediterranean, where you're a little bit darker for the average white European, but still white so you can fit in, I think that that has a lot to do with how she got to where she got, was that she was attractive.
But I think some of the romanticism of the era could be playing into, of course, if you find a dainty woman wandering on the countryside, that it's more fun for the story to talk about her being this great beauty. And
it's hard, again, if I'm basing yours off of photos that you can find on immediate image search, I'm going to have to give her a 4 and not a 5, even though everyone said she was very, very beautiful, just because she's kind of all over the map in those, and it's hard to get a clear picture of what she actually looked like. So I'm going to give her a 4 instead of a 5, even though I think she probably was a 5, just because it's hard to tell from renderings. So
because of the uncertainty and playing into the part, I'll give her a 4 too.
Alright, so social impact.
This is a category where I don't think necessarily either of them are gonna...
I don't think either of these rank super high in social impact, yeah.
These were maybe a fun story for a news cycle. I don't think either of these people really made a dent on the historical landscape. So I would say Otto probably was a fun story. There is a lot of... The fantasy novel Every Inch a King was written based on his story, with the assumption that he had actually become the King of Albania. It's a fictionalized version that he inspired. But there is a definite chance that Otto lifted his story from The Prisoner of Zenda, which was a fictional novel published before his con.
Okay, so your vote is...
So, I mean, I give him a 1. He did maybe inspire some fiction, but he didn't have, like, a revolutionary impact in any way.
I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, I mean, I'll even say 2 for him, because there was some stuff out there. Neither one of these ranks very high, like you said. What I will say is Mary Baker was so charming that even after she was unmasked, rather than going to prison or really having any consequences befall her, the woman who took her in actually gave her enough money to allow her to sail to Philadelphia, rather than being, like, executed or sent to Australia with the criminals. She took sympathy on her and said, here's enough money to go to Philadelphia and start a new life in America. But the press, a British reporter, wrote a story claiming that while sailing to America, Princess Caribou's boat was blown off course and drifted near St. Helena, which is where Napoleon was exiled to. And supposedly Princess Caribou rode out to meet Napoleon, who was immediately captivated by her charms, and the former emperor begged her to marry him, but she refused. And the story was supposed to be a joke, but the pairing of Napoleon, who was obviously a very hot topic at the time, and Caribou, who was also sort of a hot topic and sort of riding on the same coattails as Napoleon, plus she was so, like, pretty and charming, that it immediately took hold of... It's a myth that you see over and over again in press and verbal accounts that have reported that story as fact, like, after she was unmasked.
So this is kind of a very early case of somebody believing an Onion headline?
That's exactly what it is. That's a funny way to put it. So there was a film in 1994 called Princess Caribou that added some fictional elements to the story. I don't know anything about the film, but there was also a novel about her life that was published in 2015. There was also a couple of stage musicals, adaptations of her life, including a full stage musical called Princess Caribou, which opened in 2016 in London. So they're still talking about her, you know, with a film in 1994, a novel in 2015, a musical in London in 2016. She's definitely still a little bit in the zeitgeist. I still don't think lasting social impact, she has a huge mark there, but I do think that maybe she's a little bit more so than Otto, just as far as, like, still being in the zeitgeist, and also the sort of, like, fame after the fame. Mm-hmm. Having a little bit longer of a news cycle maybe than Otto did. Because most of his post-fame fame was him standing up in a sideshow and saying, "This is what I did, everybody."
Yeah, but he was very good at cultivating his own post-fame fame.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give Mary Baker a 3 on social impact. I don't think she ranks any higher than a 3, but I do think that the fact that they're still making musicals about her as recently as last year says something.
I mean, I do think it says something, and clearly it's a story and an idea that people enjoy and get hooked into and have perpetuated in that way. But since this category usually indicates that they revolutionized the way we think of atomic elements or something like that, or started a whole political movement, I'm going to give her a 2, just because that's sort of the scale we're playing on.
That's fair. You've actually talked me into giving her a 2 as well. That is fair, because that is usually the kind of scale in which we judge social impact, and this is not nearly, like, discovering elements, or revolutionizing feminism, or writing one of the great American novels, or whatever, you know, it's definitely not on that level. So I am downgrading my 3 to a 2.
Wow, I think that's one of the first times I've ever gotten you to change a rating.
And so I think, I'm just going to come out and say it. Je ne sais quoi for these people is 5 across the board for everybody.
6, 7, 24.
When you're talking about con artists, that's the whole thing. The whole thing is being charming enough and having enough je ne sais quoi to be able to convince people that a lie is the truth. Mm-hmm.
Otto actually got the German authorities to issue all his official documents with Otto I, former king of Albania, on them. Like, his official documentation said that. So yeah, I'm with you. 5s across the board for these two.
Yeah. I think that in a similar vein, getting the German authorities to say former king of Albania on your paperwork. Yeah. I think equally is a story about the press still calling her Princess Caribou and talking about her like rendezvous on an island with Napoleon, who is captivated by her instantly, is a similar kind of like je ne sais quoi.
She was Mary Baker, the governess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right, so I have the totals.
Dun 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 dun.
And we have Mary Baker in the lead with a score of 31, and Otto Witte following up very closely with a score of 28. So, it was a very close race. I really think that if it had been for the walrus mustache pictures being the only pictures I could find, it would be an even closer race.
You still have to admit he looks charming, right? Even if
I don't think so. I think he looks like a sack full of mustache.
Okay, well, that was apparently his downfall. If I ever run into him in the afterlife, I will tell him get better facial hair.
Yeah.
And a tailor.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that would do him a world of good. So, all right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And please feel free to hit us up at Historically Hot on Twitter if you have either suggestions for a category or you have suggestions for a different hottie for the category of con artist, or you think that the scores were totally wrong and someone deserved to win more than what our numbers ended up telling us. Please feel free to voice your opinions. And
give us a counterpoint.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening.
We will see you next time.